Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club Kids Edition for the month of June 2021. It is so good to see you guys this morning, or not see you because you can see me, I can't see you. You know what I mean. We've got a really cool book this month. It's fun, it's funny, it's adventurous, it's action-packed, it teaches you lessons, it's everything you want in a book. Right, because that's what you want. It is No One Returns from the Enchanted Forest by Robin Robinson, who is right there. Hi, Robin.
Hey, how's it going?
Very good. How are you?
I am melting in this record heat wave, but otherwise I'm good.
Very
I'm
good.
holding
Yeah,
together.
well, it hopefully it will subside very fast and things will go back to normal. And yeah,
It'd be lovely.
Yeah, so the first question I always ask, and well, you did this once before,
Yes.
many years ago, but my first question always is, and let's ask it again: why comics? Of all the things that you could be doing, what is it about comics that thrills you, that excites you, that makes your heart sing, that is the medium that you need to tell stories in?
There was never any question. I was obsessed with comics from the time I was very, very young. My dad had a collection of Charles Addams Family comics, and I pored over it. And I mean, like, I was a little too young to get most of what was going on, but I got wonderful inky artwork, and I got monsters are great.
Yeah.
And I got pictures are extremely good. So I pretty much from there, from like under 5, was just very obsessed with comics. Eventually, I jumped in through X-Men. Was a really big thing in the early 90s for me, and somehow got both my little brothers and my mother involved in comics. We all got very excited about like mostly Marvel titles, and then from there we sort of drifted around. We got a bunch of other indie books, and as manga became a more and more accessible thing, we got that. There'd always been like Tintin sitting around at my school, so it's just like there was no question. Like, I love picture books, which I also do, and I love prose, but comics are where it's at. Like, comics are what I've always wanted to do. I have always been thinking about them and reading them and drawing them. So
yeah, is there a particular thing about the language of comics that you like, other than
yes. Yeah, it is that you see the world completely filtered through somebody's, art style. But of course, what is the art style but their vision, right? Like, you're seeing a perspective, like everything is remade. Like, every single aspect of it is constructed. And I think that that's just so fascinating. I love world building. I love how transportative they are.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the things that I like the most about comics is literally the opposite. It's how involved the audience is in reading comics, right?
Yes.
Because it's really the only medium where the audience controls the pace and controls, like, going backwards, going forwards. It's not like any other medium at all.
Yeah, certainly not like any other visual medium. Like, where the straightforwardness, like the time is perceived so differently in comics than in like film or even theater. Yeah. And I definitely think about it in terms of like, what can I do in a comic that wouldn't work in animation or film? Not to make it too difficult on anybody who might want to adapt something, but just definitely thinking about like what makes a comic and how to use time in that interesting kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, I would point to maybe, there's a scene in here in the Enchanted Forest where Bix is following Pella and sees the forest through her eyes and then sees it through what she thinks Pella's eyes are, which is not a thing. You could never do that in any other medium at all. Like, comics is really the only way you could make that kind of thing work.
Yeah, if you did that in any other media, it would be like using this. Like, it would definitely be using something. It would be using the language of comics really specifically to do that. Yeah, no, stuff like that is really because some of those things do also carry over to picture books, which is my other big love. It's interesting for me to play with, like, that is very much a picture book technique that I used there too. Like that idea that it's almost like a search the image kind of
Right.
thing that's like engaging in that way.
Mm-hmm. What percentage of your time is picture books versus comics?
Comics take up so much more time. Picture books, it's 500 words and you revise it 500 times, and that takes up a remarkably large amount of time. But in the time it took me to make this comic, like to do No One Returns, I don't know how many like picture book dummies I worked on in that time. Right now, my first picture book that'll be like a big project is coming out, I think in 2022. Like I think it's going to be out late next year.
Okay.
And it will take me 3 months to work on the final art. The writing has taken me years because it's always kind of going on in the background. But No One Returns took me, 18 months to 2 years to do all the artwork. So.
Oh, that's pretty quick. It seems like for how many pages we got here? What are our page numbers? 220 or
225,
so.
yeah, something like that. It's a really quick pace. The actually, like, I wrote a very in-depth script first.
Okay.
And I kind of need to. I really, like, as much as I'm all about the visual, because that's what the medium is, I'm very verbal. And I almost write descriptions of comic pages before I draw them, because that helps me, like, I do visualize in a wordy kind of way. So it took me quite a while. Like the script, when the final script came together really quickly, but it was like at least a year of just developing and trying to figure out what I wanted out of this project. And it came directly from thinking about the last project and what I learned from that and what I wanted to do the next time. So
yeah, you're talking about City on the other side?
I am talking about City.
I'm just making sure that I didn't miss something in the middle.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. City was obviously it was in a city versus a more fantasy thing here. But it was a much more realistic book, I suppose.
Yes.
And this is a much more cartoony book.
Yes, in every way. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you maybe talk about the difference in drawing those kinds of things?
Yeah. That was part of why this book ended up the way it did, was that while I absolutely loved all the research that we did for The City on the Other Side, I loved the process, but I found that the amount of like physical effort that it took for me to draw in that style in such a short amount of time — I had barely 18 months to draw that book, which is just how it is. I ended up feeling like I wanted to streamline that process for something that was more natural for my hand. And I was doing, after doing that much cartooning so quickly, I was beginning to figure out what was better. Like, just what strokes were better for my hand to make, what was going to let me be more expressive with less work. And so, of course, to fill in all that work that I wasn't spending because of just the art style, I then drew a million little plants to just absolutely destroy anything about it being time-saving. Can't make it too easy.
Yeah. Is there something about cartoony characters, the way they kind of bend and stretch, that changes the way you tell a story?
It does. I think that it made me feel so much more free to have their body language be more expressive, to see a lot more about who they are based on how they would, because they're not moving, they're very static images, but I think they feel like they flow and move a little bit more when they're cartoony on that level. And I like that. Like, that was especially for a story like this that is, it's contemplative in moments, but it is actually kind of actiony. And I wanted to just get that sense of movement, and just, it's so few pages to try to characterize everybody. And I feel like the level of like how broad cartooning is when it's this cartoony, I felt like that lets me do that a little bit quicker.
Yeah. It's interesting because of the influences or your formative work. It really is. Charles Atom, I guess, is cartoony, but but it's a very kind of formal.
Yeah, it's
you know,
editorial. Yeah,
everything's very posed. Everything's very
yeah, which I like too.
And X-Men, certainly X-Men comics from the 90s are not at all cartoony at all.
A little bit of the Chris Bacalo era, which I really liked. But I kind of liked it before he. I liked that earlier era that was more stiff and posed. Actually, it's interesting. Yeah, no, I really liked that. And when it comes to like Japanese comics, so many of them are really stiff and posed, and then others are so liquid and flowy that it's ridiculous. And it's a mixed bag, just like it is with American cartooning.
Yeah. So, what made you want to do? I mean, other than a reaction to doing something super realistic, well, not super realistic, but much more realistic. Yeah.
What else made me want to work on?
Yeah, want to do something in a cartoony style. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was starting to feel more natural for my hand.
Okay.
As I said, like, and also just again, like, it let me try to characterize them a little more quickly. I also was aiming this book a little younger. And I wanted to kind of appeal to myself at that age, really thinking in terms of like what kind of animation was interesting to me at the time. I think that it's interesting that we're talking about the style so much because I wasn't that hung up on it. It really just felt very natural for me to work with this. It's a little closer to how my picture book stuff looks as well, or how my picture book stuff developed. And so for me, all of these styles are all kind of, they orbit around each other a little bit. It's whatever is feeling more natural for my hand at the time.
Yeah. Did you go to school for art or self-taught? What's your?
I did. I went to the ill-fated art institutes back in the day for video game art and design, but by the time I had graduated, I had a children's book portfolio, and because one of my professors was a children's book illustrator as well as having been in the game industry, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't think you like any of the things you're doing in this major. Like, you seem totally miserable. Let's work on this other stuff you seem to actually care about." I did like a final project before like the last quarter of school or whatever. I had to do some sort of like track my influences, and they were all kidlit artists and cartoonists. And he was like, "Yeah, let's do that actually." And it was very, very helpful. I needed to hear that. I still care about video games an awful lot. I think this book maybe even shows that I care about video games. When we're talking about the cartooniness of it, it has more to do with like the Wind Waker and, with that Zelda game and other, like, it probably has more to do with just enjoying that kind of like proportion of character to world that you get in a lot of sprite-based video games. I think may also be where that came from.
Yeah,
they're a big influence on me too.
Yeah, it's always great to have a teacher who tells you you're on the wrong path. Like,
really
maybe you should be going over here. That's kind of the best kind of teacher, is the one who's not afraid to like reorient you a little bit. What made you take video games specifically as your focus, or was that what the option was?
It was 2004, and I was obsessed with video games. I had still have a very close friend who we constantly talked about the games we would build together. This is a very different era of video games. Sure. And we had been, at the time, really interested in more throwbacky stuff. And this was kind of before Steam really happened.
Right.
So it was, we were both really excited about making games, and I wanted to know everything there was to know, but I had never been part of like the modding community or anything like that. So I thought this was the way I was going to learn to do this, and ended up realizing that I cared more about telling stories than it being in a video game format.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. How did you then go from children's books to comics?
I had always been making comics. That was something, and actually that same professor really warned us against comics, and he was right. Because they do not pay great. Comics will break your heart is like, sure. There's a reason that's a saying. Sure. But the problem is that and I remember at the time, this was like, man, I was a baby and I was telling him this. I was like, but if the comics bug has bitten you, you're bitten for life and it doesn't go away. You can't not make comics if you want to make comics. So I was always making them. And I was at a children's book conference that had years later that had a little bit of a like, hey, here's a graphic novel intensive course you could take. And I did some comic pages for this, and it was run by Colleen A. Venable from First Second.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time I'd ever felt actually like there was a place for me in children's literature.
Yeah.
Like all these years of being obsessed with it and working really hard. I'd even done a book for Penguin at that point, and didn't matter. This was the first time that I was like, yeah, there's room for me in picture book. Like there's room for me in that entire world. And it was pretty magical that a couple years later, The City on the Other Side was picked up by First Second. So that's been, and they also, of course, published No One Returns from the Enchanted Forest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just because I'm curious, this is a thing that I know very little about children's books. Illustrated children's books as opposed to comics.
Yeah,
I know a lot about kids comics, but
yes.
You were saying that there's that a lot of times you don't make a lot of money doing comics, which is certainly true. Is that not also true with illustration? The reason I ask is because it always has struck me that most books of whether it's illustrated, whether it's written, a lot of times you don't make a lot of money doing that.
You are correct. However, you are very correct. However, picture books are kind of prestigious in publishing for a lot of reasons. Everyone thinks they can make them, and they are the hardest thing to make. They are unbelievably difficult. I wrote a prose novel that was like 150,000 words in the time it took me to revise 1,500 words worth of picture books last year. It's ridiculous. It is so difficult. But at the risk of being too businessy, I am being paid as much or more for a picture book than I was for Enchanted Forest for a fraction of the work. It's not that you make so much money, it's that it's for a much smaller rate of work. So you can do more. Same with, when you talk to comic writers, how it's not like they're being paid very well, but they are physically capable of writing more comics in a month than even a penciler can do in a month. So it's just like the number of revenue streams you have is smaller. It's very businessy to talk about, but it's
I think these things are useful to have in the conversation so that people know. Because a lot of this is a black box. I am curious though, because at least I think I heard you say to narrow those words down so they're the right words for the picture book was also 18 months, and that it took you about 18 months to do this. So
it did.
Is it not roughly the same amount of work?
Revising, the problem is that while writing is an incredible amount of background work, this is the thing I'll always say, like every once in a while that gross conversation of like what's more work, writing or drawing, comes up, and it's a horrible conversation because it's totally useless. But I know that for me, because I write and draw, the background work of writing and the background work of drawing is similar, right? Like when you're writing, you're having it's just always in the back of your mind getting worked on. It's weird for people to not know that drawing works the same way. You're always observing the world and processing it and trying to figure out how to make that make that two-dimensional. Like that's something that's going on the same way that writing is always going on. But literally the 2 hours of looking at a document and trying to revise those words to make them perfect that I might do in a 3 or 4 day period versus literally drawing for 8 to 12 hours a day. There's no comparison. It's just not comparable at all. That's a lot of time being spent, but it's not time working. For writing, you're lucky if you can write 4 hours a day. It's so much more likely to be 15 minutes to an hour. And it's not that that's not enough writing. It's that that's as much as you really can do.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. That was a really good explanation of that because, that makes a lot of sense to me. So what was the putting together the book? So actually, let me before I ask that question, the title's really long. The
Yeah, it
title is
is.
really, really, really long. It's, I think, the longest title of any book that we've ever featured in the club for certain. Did you get any, like, where did the title come from?
All right. So for The City on the Other Side, I'm bringing this back for a moment.
Yeah.
I believe that title is also my fault. That was not the original title. It had many titles, and really late in the production of that book, we needed to change the title. I think marketing got back to us, and poor Margaret was like, what am I going to do? That the author for that book was like, what are we going to do? And we brainstormed, and I'm pretty sure I was the one who came up with this title. I love long titles. I clearly hate SEO. Like, I clearly have a vendetta against any kind of search engine optimization. For No One Returns, which is what I mean, sometimes I call it Enchanted Forest, sometimes I call it No One Returns. I almost never say the whole title unless I'm just getting. I love to hear it, and I love to say it, and I love to type it out. I love a long title. I think that this let me express the combination of wonder and like horror that I wanted the book to have, or at least that I wanted the forest in the book to have.
Yeah.
And for me, an evocative title, I don't know, like when I was a kid, my parents they still mostly have this actually, a bookshelf full of old sci-fi paperbacks that they had collected. And there were lots of Philip K. Dick and Highland titles that had really long, weird titles. And I would just imagine what a story would be based on book titles, because I was too young to actually read a lot of these at the time.
Yeah.
And I have never gotten over how much an evocative, long, weird title it just plays on my mind. Like, I love it. I'm really into them. A little bit of the ways through this book existing, through when I was working on it, I was at like a breakfast with other first second folks before Emerald City Comic Con one morning. Yeah. And one of the editors, who was she's so wonderful, but she was like, I said something like, I can't believe you guys are letting me keep this title. And she said something that made me believe for the rest of the year that there was no way I was keeping that title. And then I feel like had the pandemic not happened, they probably would have had me change it. So I feel like I slipped this by because everyone was too busy and exhausted with it to even like ask me to change it. I just love it. Like, for all I know, you can ask them, though. Maybe they love it. Like, maybe they were like, oh, we're going to really fight for this. Maybe someone fought for this title for me, and I hope they did. But I feel like I pulled one over on the world by being allowed to.
Because of the pandemic. That's okay. I like that. Do you ever like do you ever acronize it? Norfef?
I haven't yet. Yeah. I haven't. When they did obviously for file names back and forth, they usually did, and my brain couldn't recognize it, even though The City on the Other Side is still Kotos to me.
Right.
But but this one, it's always Enchanted Forest and No One Returns to me.
Yeah. It's interesting that it's both.
Both are important.
Yeah. So okay. So with that out of the way, where did the notion for the book come from? Like even more particularly, like, why goblins as opposed to other kinds of fantasy creatures?
Yeah, I had been drawing I don't know, like, I like a humble little monster a lot. And I felt like I could do a lot with, like, people who play D&D have a really strong concept of what a goblin is that has pretty much nothing to do with folklore goblins anyway. Goblin is a term that, while it is a little fraught, like, there are definitely people who have really negative, like, there are negative racial connotations that can come up here, which I thought about a lot when I worked on this. But they are also a really vague category of something that is maybe fairy-like, but not as beautiful and ethereal. And I wanted that. I wanted them to be, especially because I'd worked on another book with fairies, right? Sitting on the Other Side, which had a whole variety of different kinds of fairies. With this one, I was, like, actually First Second asked me when I was going to pitch this book to them, they were like, does it have fairies in it? And I was like, yeah, actually, it kind of does. I love folklore creatures, but I really like to do my own twist with them. And I just felt like this would give me a big platform to work from. That it's an easy to understand word. Weirdly enough, I discovered into this. My name is, I have a weird family name. Like Robin is a name that I got because it has family significance, not because my parents just liked it, but the root word for goblin and Robin is the same.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it's Hob is like in there, right? So
Uh-huh.
it's like in like Old English stuff. I discovered that way into this, and I was like, yeah, that's cool. Like I feel like that's a good like synchronicity there. Like I'm cool with that. So I wanted to have these like very humble creatures that were small and relatable to child me, that were still cool. They were still interesting. I thought a lot of like the genesis for this book has a little bit to do with me thinking about how influential the Legend of Zelda games were on me as a kid and to this day, and how the aspect of those, especially like the early ones where Link is small, like by
Mhm.
Ocarina of Time, like he grows up at some point in it, but he's still small. Like he's not a big guy, and that made those games so accessible to me and my little brothers, because it wasn't the power fantasy of being someone who is big and strong. It was the power
Right.
fantasy of being yourself and still being able to do all of this.
Yeah.
But I wanted to tell a story for a younger age group that could not be that like I wanted to tell a story that was a fantasy story that was interesting and dangerous and even a little romantic in
Yeah.
in whatever, in many different senses of the word,
Sure.
where the problem wasn't going to be solved by violence or swords. I love violence and swords,
Yeah.
but I could not in good conscience tell a story that involved that
Right.
for the age group I was trying to tell this story for.
Right.
And I felt like it was a challenge. Like that was a challenge that I had. I was like, okay, I really want, and I also wanted to do that kind of parallel story where you have the character who is the least heroic, like who has no interest in doing the kinds of things that a hero kind of character
Sure.
would do, is the one who has to take action, whereas the character who wants to take action is stuck not being able to. So all of those ideas were things that were on my mind, and that was like the soup that was going on where I got to distill all these pieces from.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Let's put a pin in that for 1 second because Jordan tells me that we have a question, and anybody who's watching, you can ask questions, and we will get them asked for you. The question is from Vincent. I'm going to mispronounce your last name, so I'm not even going to try. It says, this is Melina anyway. Hi, this is Melina. How did you come up with the idea for the Earth Queen, the Water Queen, and their mother?
Yeah. So much of this story has to do with these very small, humble creatures having to face off against something so big that it is almost their environment. I was thinking about the conflict of like a character versus their environment, but embodying that environment in a person, and then the person is a parallel to the main characters. So they're sort of goddesses, but they're also just bratty teenage girls in the same way that the main characters are dealing with their own internal brattiness, because it's really hard to it's really hard to be a sibling. It's really hard to be kids who are having to look out for each other when you're so different. And I really liked the idea of like elemental like creatures and elemental goddesses are a thing I'm super obsessed with. It was, again, nice synchronicity with City on the Other Side, where we kind of played around with ideas like that as well. So I really kind of always in the back of my head have kind of cosmology involving these very like elemental characters. And in this case, I have interesting plans for, I don't know, I know where they came from. I have more to say about those characters.
Oh, nice.
But it'll be really, so we'll see if I get to do that. But it was
Is it
definitely just the idea that that they are like big and scary, and basically the environment itself.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That would be great to have more in this world, in this environment.
It would.
Yeah. No, that would be great. I think we'd all love to see that. How do you pitch a book like this? What's the process for you?
I was kind of lucky because, I mean, like normally I would have just made a pitch package, which I did anyway, right? A pitch package would be like a really thorough outline, maybe some script pages, somewhere between 5 and 20 actual comic pages, bunch of concept art, make that into a PDF, and then if you have an agent, you have your agent send it to the acquiring editors. If you don't have an agent, you find open submissions for publishers. That's the process. Like, that's the official process. And I did all that, but because I had done a book with For Second previously, and because my beloved aunt wanted to go see her favorite Italian folk singer perform for the first time in the US in New York in November of 2017, I believe, I managed to be in New York at like right as I had wrapped up The City on the Other Side, and they let me pitch this book to them in person.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, I actually got to talk to them about it, which was great, because I got to hear their feedback immediately. And I was really lucky because their feedback was very positive and very little changed from my initial idea to this final book. Like, that is unusual. Like, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be that lucky again. But I had just like really, like, I think that I had just honed in exactly what I wanted to do very tightly. So.
Yeah, that's cool. Was it different working on this book solo as opposed to City, where you had an author working with you?
Yeah, Meredith Scott is amazing and so so aware of every little piece of the business and how to work with everybody. Like, I could not have asked for a more wonderful collaborator, and just what a wonderful writer. She was great. That whole project was, like, I owe so much to her. She worked so hard and did so much for that book, and I was, like, learning everything that I could from her. And to do that all myself was definitely difficult. I was lucky because by this point I was agented, and so it was nice to have my agent in my corner as well. And I had the knowledge of how this process worked, so that I was way less anxious. And which was nice. It's like, it's harder and scarier, but I also was like a little bit more like, yeah, but you've done this before. And that sometimes it takes a while to get feedback, and that you're going to have to do a lot of the work on your own and just trust yourself. And I really had learned to trust myself a lot more by the time of this book, which is very terrifying. So it's really exciting. I mean, it's like knowing that people are reading it now is obviously the best thing in the world, and completely terrifying, because it's like, there's no one else. It's all me. Like, everything you're getting here was my dumb idea. So I have to deal with that. If there's any issues, I'm the one who has to come up with an explanation.
Yeah. You said that you wrote a pretty involved script initially. Was it literally panel by panel descriptions, or was it more kind of Marvel style, where you're like, on this page these things happen, here's some dialogue?
Very early outlined versions were the second way, but no. I wrote descriptions of each panel that included what the characters were going to look like and what they were feeling. I needed to write all the really internal stuff so I could remember what was supposed to be externalized in the artwork. I really did panel by panel breakdowns. I did not follow them perfectly, which is definitely something I'd learned from previous projects. But having done that gave me not only something for the editors to like understand and give me feedback on, which is magical, but also just like, it was nice for me to like, in a moment, if when I'm tired and working on trying to get 6 pages done in a day, which is terrible, it was nice that I had put that thought into it ahead of time, so there's at least something for me to consider as I'm trying to translate it to the page.
Yeah, that makes sense. The editorial process. I mean, I'm assuming that by your second graphic novel, you get much less notes, right? Or is that wrong?
I got way more notes, but that's because I also got the notes on the script, which I didn't have to see for Margaret. Like I mean, I did see some of them, like, but there were phases of that project where it was out of my hands, and it wasn't, it was her work that she had to do. I didn't get that many notes though. Like, I would say I got more notes on this, but not that many. There were a couple pages that needed to be redone to the point that they communicated more clearly, but most of them, like, the concept was working. I just had to execute it, which happens. Yeah, it was pretty smooth. There were definitely a couple moments that we had to go back and forth on, but it was just not that many. Again, I'm very lucky. Like, not every project I'm telling myself this. I'm like, not every project will be smooth. And not every aspect of this was smooth, but it
Sure.
was pretty smooth. And I need to remind myself that that's sometimes it's almost serendipitous that it was.
Yeah. Jordan tells me we have another question. So
Great.
that question, or two questions even. So those two questions are one at a time. Liza Siegler, how did you come up with the names of the characters and how they look?
Yeah. That's exciting and fun. Bix is sort of named after Bix Beiderbecke, who's a wonderful jazz musician from bygone era. I am obsessed with that name. I just love it. I love how it sounds. I like how it's small and snappy and 3 letters. And every other character name was me thinking about what works well with that. So I really started with her name, and then everybody else's name came around that. For Pella, I wanted something that sounded cute and feminine, but also like that you could yell a little bit. So it has that like Pella, but it's Pella. Like I sort of thought about that. And then for Cece, it needed to be like energetic because she is so energetic, and I wanted something that like brought that too. I liked the repeated syllables for her too because I think that helps. I don't know. I think it really. She might have a longer name than that, but that is definitely what anyone in her life would call her. So that is what she calls herself. For appearances, I kind of had a strong idea of what I wanted characters to look like. I knew that Bix needed to be mostly like coat and hat, like just this lump of outerwear and hair. And the big long noses were incredibly important to me. I am obsessed with noses. I'm really like, that's a thing that I love to draw. I think that they're the anchor of the face. So it was really, really fun to have that aspect for all of them. And of course, Cece has her little snub nose. But I got really into the idea of Bix always having one eye covered because I think that it makes her, like moody and romantic. But also I only have to ever draw one eye at a time. Extremely convenient, but also a fun challenge to get a lot of expression across with fewer facial features. So it's like it's a challenge, but also easier. You can see that was like my whole thought process for this book was like, what if I make things easier and then extremely challenging? I went through so many iterations of what these characters could look like. Here are these, like, I drew them, this is pretty early on, and then I just did, like, color tests, all of which are great, and none of which are what I used. But the most precious thing from this era that I have is my then 10-year-old intern also colored them for me once, and I still have this. She's a whole teenager now, but at the time she was 10, and she's one of my dear friend's kids, and is the best. And so she helped me with those two. We worked back and forth with color a lot. Cece, design-wise, is very based off of an Oni, and a little bit specifically based off of Lum from Unusei Yatsura, because she's my dream girlfriend. So she has always kind of been like red or pink, because Oni are kind of like that. So I knew what she was going to look like. For the others, they were green for an extremely long time. And I am very happy that they ended up lavender. Like, I like how that looks. I like how it fit with everything. Because, man, I loved the color palette with Bix and Pella being green. It looked great. But the forest is green.
Right.
And if you're going to contrast your little green characters versus the forest, I was like, well, this is just setting myself up for torment for no reason. So I thought a lot about how they were going to be, like, iconic. I wanted to think about how they would look in front of the environments that I had planned for them and how they were going to look on their own.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. We have another one, Jordan says, which is Nelson Mitchell with his Enzo. Hello, Enzo. I love the book, and Bix is my favorite character because they are obsessed with yarn. Where did that come from?
I have a lot of friends who do various kinds of knitting and crochet. My grandmother used to knit and I have a lot of hand knit things she made for me, and I miss her a lot. So those hand knit things that I still have from her, I wish I don't have it in front of me, but she made a hat that looks like a turnip that I still wear sometimes. It was definitely made for me when I was like very, very little, but I'm still pretty short, so I guess I still count as little. I really I don't knit or crochet. I am very I'm not dyslexic, it's dyscalculic. I don't know how to I am very bad at things where I have to remember the order and direction of anything with left and right. It's like literally my editors had to continually tell me what side. See, I still can't do this in front of the camera. What side Winky's eye is on. Like that was
Right.
like one of the final edits that we did, was literally going through the whole book to make sure I knew that her eye is consistently like the button is sewn on the correct side. I just can't like I cannot visually tell. So I can't knit myself at all, but I love yarn. I love all those kinds of fibers. There's a lot of weaving and yarn art in my family history. Like it's just a thing that I've always been surrounded by. And Bix says it herself, right? Like that yarn looks soft and fluffy, but it's really like tough. And
Yeah.
I thought that was like a perfect like symbol for how she is and how all the goblins are, how all of them, like kind of how all the characters are, right? Like they look like cute and small, and like Bix is really chubby, and it just like, but they're really, really tough and useful and can do a lot. And I love that. Like I think it's such a simple idea, right? That yarn is almost just a line when you draw it in this book. But you can do anything with it in the same way that you can do anything with a line in a drawing.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. That's fantastic. Jordan, do we have one more, or did you? Because you kept the sign up. That's all the reason I'm asking.
I got one more.
There is one more. All right, one more. For the queens, why earth and water? Why not sky or fire?
That's okay. There is a long answer to that'll come up later, maybe. Think about it as terraforming. That the Earth Queen, fire, like in a volcano sense, is kind of part of her thing, and that for the Water Queen, in like a water cycle, like clouds in the sky sense, there's a little bit of sky involved with her too. Specifically, it's because those two things, like the water and the land, are what are the environment that the characters are having to, like, they're on this island, they're surrounded by water. The water on the island is like incredible. I mean, it's the only fresh water they have. It's really important that they can't live without those two things, so they're the most important. Like sky and fire are also very important, but they're kind of a little more of a broad, confusing concept for these characters in this place. But largely think about it in terms of terraforming.
Makes sense. That makes sense to me. Let's maybe talk about the physical craft. You work physically? Do you work digitally? What's your process?
This whole book is very, very digital. I love working digitally because I can make lots of mistakes and never worry about it. And I am too much of a perfectionist to experiment if I'm not like feeling like I'm not wasting things. I'm getting better about this. I actually do some experimentation in as you saw, like these were colored with like, I mean, this is still the intern's one, but these were colored with like Copic marker. And so I do some amount of like physical media. If you check out my Robin Robinsonia Twitter feed, I do have some other images where I show like different like watercolor versions of the characters, and the first piece of art that I did that captured the feeling of this book was a watercolor painting. But I really, really couldn't do this book at all until I thought of it in terms of what the digital tools were going to be. That being said, pretty early on, I did this very crazy ink drawing that was also for me to kind of capture the feeling of this book. There's tiny little Bics down in the corner, and all I can say is that after doing this, I definitely knew that I needed to always do my books digitally, because for some people, my little brother is an amazing comic artist also, and he hand inks everything with real ink. It's faster for him. His own terrible wrist trouble that we all cartoonists destroy their arms and hands doing this, but and for him, traditional inking really, really helps that problem. For a lot of cartoonists, it does.
Yeah.
For me, I crunch every pen in my hand so tightly that it's just physically terrible. But I can actually I can do things digitally that will allow myself to like hold it like less. Like I can make the crank up the sensitivity so that I don't have to press very hard and still get a good line.
Yeah. Interesting. So you have your script and then you've got, I mean, not a blank piece of paper, but you've got a blank screen to draw. You thumbnail? Do you?
Oh yeah.
Or that you're working digitally? Because we've talked to a couple people who work digitally, and they're like, "Oh no, I'm basically just sketching it out onto the page, and it's not a thumbnail per se. It's not a separate thing, right? Like it's the first layer, I guess."
And I know a lot of people who do not write a script without basically just notes on thumbnails. That's not how I work at all. As I said, I wrote a script where I like described every panel to myself. And then I literally drew the entire book in thumbnails. Some of this was the process that First Second wanted, but it's honestly the best process for me too. It sucks. It is so much work to do thumbnails because you're forcing yourself to basically draw the whole book, but crappy.
Right.
Excuse my language, but like you are trying to just like go through the entire book and figure out what it's all going to look like and lay all these things out. And it is so worthwhile for me. It's like that amount of work. I really front load a lot of work, which is funny because I also backload a lot of work because drawing comics, nothing makes it not work. But I know that the more thought I can put into it in the early stages, the better, because by the end, you're just bonkers. Like when you're looking at deadlines and you're just like, well, I just need to color 12 pages today, no biggie. If you're still making tons and tons of decisions when you're doing that, it's so fatiguing. Like, it's like, think about decision fatigue being very, very real, and how the more decisions you have to make, the more tired you get. It's like, one of the ways that I try to preserve my poor physical form later on in a project is to put a lot of work in the early days, which also is rough. A lot of work. But yeah, I thumbnail everything.
Does it make it harder to keep the later work fresh because you've put in so much, like, and you're almost just sort of mechanically not reproducing, but making it, just a little bit better.
No, I totally know what you're asking. No, because my thumbnails are so sloppy. I keep them so loose that on the one hand, you'll never replicate the incredible energy and looseness of a scrawl. You never will. But it doesn't matter because the people don't see the scrawl. And as long as you can try to recapture that, that's the best I can do. I really do try to leave a lot. Like, I don't do very tight pencils. I do a little bit. Like, I will take my layout drawings, my thumbnails, they are very much scribbles and blobs. It is really a layout for me to understand what the flow between panels is going to be and how much of the panel is taken up by a head, or is this where the character's foot is slipping on a mushroom? Like, it's really scribbles. And then I will go in and do a slightly more detailed drawing to just like over that really, like, usually, and I crank it down to a really low opacity, so it's like very faint, and then I ink over that. And because I'm inking over something really faint, it's forcing me to again have those really fresh decisions while I'm doing the like more final art.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
It's such a concern. Staying fresh is a big concern for this.
And are you also doing your own lettering, or is that a separate production step?
I did my own lettering for this book. I learned how to do it. My little brother had been deeply diving into lettering, and so he and I had great conversations back and forth, and he did go through and yell at me a little bit, which is good. Also, the first second team also looked at the letter, like definitely went over it and helped me make sure that it was at all readable. But yes, that is my lettering.
Yeah. Is this, it's a font based on your handwriting, or
It is not. It is a Blambot.
Okay.
It's a Blambot font called
Okay.
Imaginary Friend.
Okay.
Which I love. I love. I use this for. I use this for like every comic that I work on. I probably should branch out, but it just feels good to me.
Nice. Yeah. Nice.
My handwriting is unreadable. I will never hand letter a comic. It is.
Okay.
You cannot read my handwriting.
Okay. Of the, because you've got the bestiary back in the back of the book, and just various critters. And is there one more than another that like you just you really fell in love with?
Yes. I have there's a lot that I'm really into. Like the bestiaries, I'm so glad that I got to include that. It could have been so many more pages. I wish there was more room in the book to add even more creatures. The Stalking Heron is a concept that I have had for a really long time. The idea that what is a dinosaur but a really big, terrifying bird, and that all of these birds that we think of as being really beautiful or benign, if you're small, they are really quite a threat. It's been something I'm really interested in. So integrating them into the book a lot was really great. The face deer is another thing that has popped up in my artwork for a really long time. The idea that like it turns and its face is really flat is something that I think is nice and upsetting. I think that they eat moss because I think that doesn't require a snout.
Right?
Yeah. So those are definitely things that I thought a lot about.
Yeah, the face deer, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I agree
nice
with that
upsetting.
as well. Yeah. So I guess we'll sort of wrap this up with there's two wrap-up questions. The first one is what's next for you? What do you have after this? Do you have another long-form comic project? You said you were doing a children's book. I mean, is there something you'd like to plug? What do you got?
Let's see. Unfortunately, I can't plug my picture book yet because it has not been formally announced. Understood. But I promise it exists, and it will be happening. I have a bunch of comic pitches. Right now, I don't know what's next. I know it'll be very exciting, though. I'm really looking forward to like. I have a bunch of different things everywhere from scary clowns to haunted house next door, all kinds of fun stuff.
Nice.
So that's
great. That sounds great. And then the last question, I always like ending it with, there's a lot of people a lot of kids who are reading this, people who want to do comics, and they're not sure where to start. They're not sure how to do it. What would be the piece of advice you would give someone who wants to do comics, wants to do art even generally? And it can be technical, it can be spiritual, it can be motivational, it can be really any way you want to answer that question.
Yeah, just do it. Find whatever works for you and don't convince yourself that there's something wrong with that kind of practice, right? Where like, if the only way that you can draw is in the margins of your math homework, that's great. Use that as much as you can. Eventually you'll be able to branch out and do other things with it, but don't turn away from what's working for you right now. Definitely understand that the amount of time it takes to do any project is massive and maybe longer. Like it will take whatever project you do, your entire lifetime up to that point is part of doing that project. And that is like a thing that should be hopeful for the future, is that you may not be able to accomplish exactly what you want right now, but the work you're doing that isn't getting there, that isn't perfect, is going to make you better at making the work you want to make eventually.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a perfect answer. That's not that there's a wrong answer to that question, but I like that one quite a bit. Well, I want to thank you for this book. I thought it was a fun read. It was it had a lot of action. It had a lot of heart. And so if you, the audience, are sitting at home going, I want to read something and I don't know what to read, I thoroughly, emphatically recommend No One Returns from the Enchanted Forest and Robin Robinson. This was really great. I want to thank our sponsors of the beat. I want to thank my awesome staff for letting me do stuff like this. I want to thank Jordan for running the show.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you members who were there and all the kids who were watching and asking questions. That was great. And I want to thank Robin and all creators like Robin for doing the thing that you do and making it so that we can share this excitement and energy about books. So thank you
so much too. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. Next month's book, just so you know, will be The Way of the Hive by Professor Jay Hosler. He is a professor. This actually is it's a kind of an old comic. It was called Clan Apis once upon a time, but this is a new version and it's re-edited and it's recolored and it's really great and it's about the life of bees and it's really, really cool. And then if you're like more of an adult, because this is the kids club, I know, but I got to plug the other shows as well. Our classic club is Lock and Key this month. We've got Joe Hill, Gabriel Rodriguez, and the editor Chris Ryle. And then the adult club next month is Alison Bechdel's The Secret to Superhuman Strength. So watch out for those shows coming up. And if you liked what you saw, hit that little bell thing in the corner. And otherwise, maybe join the club. But we'll see you next month. Thank you so much for your time. Take care. Thanks very much for watching this episode of the Kids Graphic Novel of the Month Club. If you enjoyed what you were seeing, please subscribe and hit the bell up in the corner. We'd like to invite you to join the club. Every month you'll get a great new book curated by our staff, and it's a fantastic program. So please join. That address is running along the bottom right now. Thanks very much.